Welcome, everyone. We are streaming live. I am Julian Katari, and I'm introducing today's Aini Living Conversations. I'm with Blue Heron Woman, who is in Indianola, Oklahoma. Today, we have a conversation that touches two things. One of our last conversation was about monogamy. It touched sexuality and relationships, and we discovered how to disassociate our monogamous thinking with many other things, and how thinking in a monogamous way can affect our freedom in so many aspects of our lives. And but then to accomplish this, we have to touch a very touchy subject, a very important thing that refers to the germ theory. We have this, and we've been talking about this. We have other conversations that you must check out in our channels about the germ theory. There's programs called just that, germ theory. So we've talked about that, but we're going to dive deeper into the germ theory and into sexual relationships. And I titled this, Ingrid, the blockages, because I didn't want to like put STDs like as, as a title. So I put how germ theory blocks our relationships. Um, that's how I titled it, because it is one of the things, like one of the main things, and
Absolutely, it is.
yeah, I mean, it's happened to me where when I've discussed being open to a non-monogamous situation with other people, um, and I ask for an argument against it. The first one they always bring about is
STDs.
STDs. That's like in there, even if you kind of know that it's not how they feed it to us. If you have suspicions about germ theory, it's still very difficult to really get rid of that that perception that they are out there and they are sexually transmitted, and that because that reinforces the germ theory, which is just a mind construct.
Yeah,
um, the germ
absolutely.
theory.
Right.
So that's our
It's compulsive moralism to force us into monogamy. That's
wow.
all. That's all the germ theory of STDs is.
Yeah,
Compulsive morality.
right. So that's our conversation today. So welcome, everyone, and that's what we're going to be talking about.
So, yes, welcome. And last century, which means in the 19th century, a doctor said the modern medical system, to the extent of perhaps 80%, is nothing but a gigantic, cruel, ludicrous, lucrative, transparent fraud. And doctors do not know what disease is, nor how it is brought about. Doctors are completely unaware of their significance or purpose, are taught that acute illnesses are acute diseases which they must prevent or cure. So with this object, they employ a battery of destructive agents, notoriously more dangerous than the ills they are supposed to cure. So poisonous drugs, poisonous vaccines, poisonous radiation, and mutilating surgery are their weapons. Perhaps the worst crime of the modern medical so-called science is the increasing effective suppression of acute illnesses. So usually this suppression has one of four consequences. One, the sufferer is killed. Number two, a foundation is laid for a long-term disease that is very difficult to heal. And number three, nature will stage more and more of acute illnesses or spring cleanings or healing crises. And so it seems like it's going on and on. And I can attest to that. I have been in a healing crisis, spring cleaning stage since March, and I turn a corner and then it blossoms again. Right? Yeah. So, and then number four, nature will effect healing, and the doctor will get full credit for the recovery. So Florence Nightingale said, Diseases are not individuals arranged in classes like cats and dogs, although the medical system wants us to believe that they are. Diseases are conditions that grow out of one another. She said, I have seen diseases begin, grow up, and turn into another thing. And dogs do not turn into cats, nor do cats turn into dogs as you watch them grow. Pigs don't turn into cows, cows don't turn into pigs, right?
Yeah.
So she said, I have seen, for instance, with a little overcrowding, continued fever to grow up and become typhoid fever. And with a little more crowding and a little less air, it becomes typhus, all in the same ward or hut. So she said, true nursing ignores infection except to prevent it. Cleanliness and fresh air from open windows with unremitting attention to the patient are the only defense a true nurse either asks for or needs. She said, way back when, the specific disease doctrine is a grand refuge of weak, uncultured, unstable minds.
Mm-hmm.
So, in 1854, Professor Pierre-Jacques Antoine Béchamp, one of France's greatest scientists, took up the study of fermentation. Up to this time, the idea prevailed that cane sugar, when dissolved in water, would spontaneously transform at an ordinary temperature into an invert sugar, which would be an equal mix of glucose and fructose. However, an experiment he did with starch caused him to doubt the truth of this idea. So he did another experiment. He dissolved pure cane sugar in water in a glass bottle that contained air, but it was tightly stoppered. He did several other bottles the same, but he added a chemical. So in the solution without any added chemical, molds appeared in about 30 days, and the inversion of the sugar went on rapidly. But the inversion of sugar and the molds did not occur in the bottles with the chemicals. This left the molds without explanation, so he did a study to determine the cause of the molds. In his next experiment, he used 11 bottles, and he accidentally spilled a little bit of liquid from 2 of the flasks. So 2 of these contained a little air that was in contact with the liquid, and molds soon appeared in these 2. And again, he found the inversion of sugar happening rapidly. But in the other 9 flasks, where there was no air, there was no mold, and there was no inversion of sugar happening. So he realized that some living organisms had been carried into the 2 flasks where the small amount of air was admitted. And those organisms acted as ferments that produced the mold and the inversion of sugar. So this proved to him beyond any possibility of doubt that the molds and inversion of sugar could not be spontaneous action, but must be due to something in the air. And so Béchamp proved that the molds occupying fermentation were or contained living microorganisms and could not be spontaneously generated, but they must be an outgrowth of a living organism carried in the air. So being the first to realize that the molds or ferments were living organisms, he went on to discover their true nature and functions and origins. And eventually, as he did, he found what he called little bodies in limestone and chalk. Yet Louis Pasteur, the father of the germ theory, continued to call fermentation life without air or life without oxygen, despite the fact that there was no fermentation that happened in bottles without air.
Mm-hmm.
So after Louis Pasteur, our father of germ theory, spent many years fixated on the concept of spontaneous germination, he finally declared that the minute organisms that caused fermentation were not spontaneously generated, but came from similar organisms with which air is impregnated.
Mm-hmm.
He held on to the belief, however, that every kind of fermentation had one specific germ, while Béchamp proved that each microorganism might vary its fermentative effect in conformity with the medium in which it found itself.
Mhm.
And he also showed that these microorganisms, under varying conditions, change their shape. We've talked about this.
Yeah, yeah.
So, in 1866, he called the little bodies he'd found in limestone and chalk, and this came from his experiment with dead cats, right? Where he, with a dead cat body, where he, no germs, nothing, and he packed it in chalk, and yet it was totally gone except for these little living organisms, which he called microzymas, from the Greek word for small ferment.
Okay.
And so he found microzymas everywhere, in all organic matter, in both healthy tissues and in disease. Where he also, in disease, he found them associated with various kinds of bacteria. So after painstaking study, he and a fellow professor decided that the microzymas were the elementary units of life rather than the cell. They discovered that the microzymas were builders of cell tissue, and they also concluded that bacteria are an outgrowth, or they're an evolutionary form of these microzymas that occur when a quantity of diseased tissue needs to be broken up into its constituent elements.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, all living organisms, from the one-celled amoeba to mankind, are associations of these minute living entities, and that their presence is necessary for cell life to grow and for cells to be repaired. So they also proved that bacteria develop from microzymas. Bacteria develop from the microzymas by passing through intermediate stages, which they described. So the germs of air, they decided, were merely microzymas, or bacteria set free when their former habitat was broken up. So then they were free to make wine. Their habitat was broken up, so now they could make wine. So with his experiment on the dead cats that we've talked about, it completely satisfied him that microzymas were the living remains of plant and animal life, of which, in either a recent or distant past, they have been the constituent cellular elements, and that they were in fact the primary anatomical elements of all living beings. He proved that on death of an organism, its cells disappear, but the microzymas remain, and they're imperishable. Further experiments with dead cats led him to the conclusion that bacteria can and do develop from microzymas, and are in fact a scavenging form of the microzymas, developed when death, decay, or disease cause an extraordinary amount of cell life to either need repair or to be broken up.
Mm-hmm.
So without bacteria, there could be no other living thing in the world. Let me say that again. Without bacteria. So all of y'all who use all your fucking antibacterial products, without bacteria, there cannot be anything living thing in the world. So what are you doing when you use antibacterial stuff?
Being ridiculous. Because it doesn't do anything.
For every animal, plant, human, owes its existence to the fertility of soil, and this in turn depends upon the activity of the microorganisms which inhabit soil in almost unconceivable numbers. So he and a host of researchers concluded that bacteria and viruses do not cause disease.
Mm-hmm.
They are there to rebuild dead or diseased tissues, or to rework body waste, and it is well known that they will not and cannot attack healthy tissues.
Mm-hmm.
So disease is nature's attempt to eliminate waste and diseased tissues due to improper living. When a drug is administered by mouth and flowing through the stomach and intestines, it encounters a series of chemical laboratories where it gets analyzed, synthesized, and any toxic matter is prepared for excretion and finally excreted. Or it might be ejected from the stomach by vomiting. But when nature's coat of mail, so to speak, nature's armor called skin, is violated, and the drug is inserted directly beneath the skin in the case of inoculations, vaccinations.
Mm-hmm.
Nature's line of defense is outflanked, and nothing can be done to hinder or prevent the action of the drug, no matter how injurious it is.
Mm-hmm.
A Dr. Sanderson wrote in a paper in 1868 that described experiments he had made. And I'm emphasizing that because we need to understand we're in 2024 and we're still stuck before 1868. So he described experiments which he had made, which proved to his satisfaction that tuberculosis followed the inoculation of animals with non-tubercular sources. So they inoculated animals with shit, with just whatever they wanted to inoculate them with, and they developed tuberculosis. Other scientists found that when they injected or inoculated animals with various products that were not tuberculosis, at least half of the animals developed tuberculosis.
Okay.
And all of the stuff they injected them with were, of course, toxic. And there is nothing that is non-toxic about all our vaccinations that we get injected.
Mm-hmm.
20 years later, Dr. Robert Koch in Berlin brought out his tuberculin, and this is the same Koch who wrote the postulates. And he killed many people with his tuberculin to cure tuberculosis. The government had to shut him down.
Okay.
So after numerous experiments done around vaccinations back then in the 1800s, and here we are 200 years later, still having the same conversation.
Nothing's changed.
Vaccination, around research into vaccinations in the 1800s, researchers found that when we get vaccinated and then don't get sick with the disease vaccinated for, it's our own immunity, not the vaccination. So also from back then, from the Farmer's Bulletin number 449 of the U.S. Agricultural Department, it stated, no one can catch rabies from an animal that bites them unless the animal has the disease. Furthermore, less than 15% of those bitten by a rabid dog and not treated will get rabies. Less than 15% of those not treated will get rabies. It also admitted that those who died of rabies after treatment died earlier than those who didn't get treated.
Okay.
The New York Anti-Vivisection Society published pamphlets that said that rabies is a very rare disease, except where dogs have been injected with rabies serum. So rabies doesn't happen unless dogs get injected with it. And then it develops, right? So so-called rabies was found to be the direct result of rabies injections over 200 years ago already. And we're still yearly injecting our dogs with rabies vaccinations. And our cats. So doctors with unquestionable authority back then said no rabic germ had ever been found. Dr. Dodson of New York wrote years ago, if people would only think for themselves and not blindly follow the agitator, we would soon be rid of this pest that's called rabies. Imagine that. If people would only think instead of blindly following the agitator, we would have not had lockdowns for COVID. And I might also add to this rabies a parvovirus now also, because that's another new, oh my God, it's a parvovirus. So the Vaccination Inquirer of London back in the early 1900s wrote that in Brazil, where at the time, back in the early 1900s, Brazil had rigid compulsory vaccination laws, the death rate from smallpox in Rio de Janeiro was 600 times higher than that of London, where they didn't get vaccinated for smallpox.
Wow.
Yes, this was back in the 1900s. We're 100 years later, and we're still doing the same shit.
Yeah. It's the remake, the eternal remake of the same story.
Yes. Back then, nobody had found viruses because they were too small. But now, with better microscopes, viruses have been found. But it's also been found that they do not cause disease. They are simply toxin gobbling messengers that our cells produce to help us adjust to environmental assaults. Environments that have fleas, mosquitoes, ticks, etc., that carry toxins can result in individuals with suboptimal nutrition becoming sick. Note the words suboptimal nutrition, right? The terrain. For instance, there was an outbreak of Zika virus that supposedly caused a bunch of babies to be born with very small heads. This was in Brazil, again, with their compulsory vaccination laws. Yet this outbreak of Zika virus followed a campaign of the DPT, diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus vaccinations given to poor pregnant women. Compulsory vaccinations. So toxins are powerful stressors, and anywhere there are concentrations of methane and carbon dioxide that displace carbon dioxide or oxygen, we might find disease. So that would be a lot of low wetland areas. But still, in cases of low oxygenation, beneficial fermentative bacteria begin producing toxins instead of helpful compounds. So, for instance, the severe vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration and muscle cramping of cholera is blamed on bacteria, but actually the killer is a toxin called cholera toxin, or CT, which the bacteria produce under low oxygen conditions. So where do we find low oxygen conditions? In 99.9% of us, because we all breathe so shallowly. We do not know how to breathe abdominally. So we cause our own disease conditions because of how we breathe. So in the 1930s and 1940s, a dentist traveled around the globe to study the health of primitive peoples living on ancestral diets. He found 14 groups in which every member of the tribe or village exhibited naturally straight teeth, wide facial structure, and freedom from tooth decay. He also noted the absence of disease in these well-nourished groups, but he found that as soon as the foods of modern commerce made inroads into the population, they became vulnerable to both chronic and infectious disease. What are these foods of modern commerce? White sugar, white flour, processed oils, right? Sodas. So the children born to those who adopted the Western diet of sanitary processed foods, which is lots of sugar, white flour, canned foods, and vegetable oils, were born with more narrow faces, pinched nasal passages, and narrow configurations of the birth canal. So therefore, a less robust body formation. And he also rejected the idea that TB was caused by a microorganism, but he instead hypothesized that the root cause was a malformation of the lungs, similar to the narrowing of the facial structure and dental deformities in those born to parents eating processed foods. He noted that Swill villagers living off their native diets, in Sweden, living off their native diets of raw dairy products, sourdough rye bread, and some meat and organ meats also had no TB. But when modern foods made their appearance, that changed and TB took hold.
Changed to what?
When modern foods made their appearance, now they got the TB. These Swedish and Danish villagers that lived off their native diets of raw dairy products, sourdough rye bread, and meat and organ meats had no TB or disease. But when modern foods made their appearance, that changed, and TB took hold.
TB, the television.
Tuberculosis.
Oh, okay. I was like TB. Okay.
He also observed that African tribesmen living on traditional foods seemed immune to the diseases in Africa. Although they went barefoot, they drank unsanitary water and lived in areas that swarmed with mosquitoes. However, once the continent of Africa became Coca-Cola colonized, the diseases have proliferated among Africans.
Wow.
Now, the disease that struck terror in American minds, polio. In the mid-1950s, a Dr. Biskin testified before Congress, telling them that polio was not the result of a central nervous poison, not a virus, or it was the result of a central nervous system poison and not a virus. Sorry. He told Congress in 1950s that polio was the result of a central nervous system poison and not a virus. But yet, they still went on to push the vaccine. What was the poison being used at that point?
The vaccine itself.
DDT.
Oh, DDT was it? Okay.
Yes.
Wow.
For those that have claimed to have isolated the polio virus, or like Pasteur, the rabies virus, how did they do that? Oh, they injected pulverized puree of diseased brain tissue into the brains of monkeys, or in Pasteur's case, he hated German shepherds. So he nailed them live to a cross and then injected their brains with this crack. And that's what he called rabies. So when the monkeys and the dogs sickened and died, we now had a scapegoat virus. And we've also been told a myth that native peoples immediately sickened and died from diseases that the colonizers brought with them, right? This is not true. The first recorded outbreaks of disease in Native Americans were recorded between 1734 and 1749, yet the first European settlement had been established over 100 years before that. So the Native Americans and the Europeans had been living together for 100 years before the Native Americans started dying of smallpox and other things like that, right?
Okay.
And it wasn't until the 1800s, another 60 years later, that smallpox, dysentery, typhus, yellow fever, tuberculosis or TB, syphilis, and other fevers became prevalent in the Aboriginal populations. What happened in the mid-1800s? Native Americans, Native South Americans, Native Mexicans had succumbed to severe disruptions. Due to intensive trapping, the game populations were dwindling, seriously affecting the availability of food for them and skins to make their clothing with and footwear. During this time, what also arrived from Europe? Processed sugar, white flour.
Okay.
Right? And we're being traded.
All the way back then, huh?
Yes. So we see the same pattern on the West Coast where the salmon fisheries were, and cargo vessels could bring as much as 800,000 pounds of toxic goods. Tribal peoples that largely were dependent on bison were not affected until the 1870s, when the animals became depleted through the deliberate campaigns to kill off the herds.
Wow.
So according to a Canadian government report, the transformation of Aboriginal people from the state of good health that impressed European travelers from Europe to one of ill health grew worse as sources of food and clothing from the land declined and their traditional colonies collapsed. This is the Canadian government that said this back in the 1800s.
Yeah, that's very important information. And I imagine that being on, under the situation of war and and women being raped and all that, of
Well,
course you're going to get.
it grew worse still. Once these people who were mobile, who traveled to their winter, they had their summer places and their winter places. Now they were confined to small plots of land. And so again, their health got worse. And again, their spiritual practices, norms, and values were outlawed. So I find this very interesting. Confined to small plots of land caused their downfall. And yet we so pride ourselves in moving to the country and confining ourselves to 2 acres and fencing ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. And all the communities that want to seek freedom and become free from the system, and they can only think of that, of a fenced, enclosed, small
plot of land.
Of land. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The point of all is that the so-called infectious diseases that cause so much suffering did not arrive until after a period of severe disruption, nutritional decline, and fear and despair were the emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So from AIDS to COVID, let's go back to 1971. This was the year President Nixon declared the war on cancer. The theory of the day was that viruses cause cancer, and it was vowed that a cure would be found by 1975. Of course, today we still see that war is a complete failure. And so a new thing needed to be found so that the CDC could justify its existence. So enter AIDS, said to be caused by HIV. Here's the truth. AIDS was not new to the 1970s and 80s. It is, in fact, the same disease as the condition caused by the immunosuppressive drugs that are used to prevent people from rejecting their organ transplants.
Oh, wow.
The only thing new to the 1970s and 80s was a cancer that they called Kaposi's sarcoma.
Mm-hmm.
So, in fact, AIDS is not a specific disease at all. It simply means the collapse of the cell-mediated immune system, known even in the 1970s to have many diverse causes. The new part, Kaposi's sarcoma, had been linked to the use of poppers or nitrile amitrates by gay men to relax the anal sphincter for anal intercourse.
Okay.
The poppers, the nitrile amitrates, are immunosuppressive.
Wow.
So once gay men started quit using poppers, Kaposi's sarcoma is no longer.
Mm-hmm.
It's that simple.
Yeah, and that's why it's they focused AIDS on the homosexual population. But because why would you get, if it's sexually transmitted? Why would anal give it more than vaginal?
Right. Yeah.
But then you found this piece of information that reveals that you found the revelation.
Yeah. In spite of 40 years of research, no one has found an HIV virus. Well, Luc Montagnier of however you say that, of France, found it. But he did say HIV virus does not cause AIDS. So the test used to make a diagnosis of AIDS can never determine causation. It is simply a test looking for genetic material of unknown origin. Is this starting to sound familiar?
Yeah.
This test is called the PCR test. When it finds a higher level of genetic particles in the blood, it simply means that the person's condition is causing a lot of genetic deterioration, probably from toxins, malnutrition, or stress, or pregnancy, or breastfeeding.
Or whatever 100 different causes might be.
So the PCR test can never determine the cause of illness or this genetic deterioration. So if you poison an organism with any type of toxin that degrades the cells, then more genetic material will be found in your blood, and the PCR test will pick this up. This means you are sick. This also applies to antibodies. They do an antibody test, right? The more poisoned you are, the more antibodies your body has to produce to protect itself. So if you look at the insert for the PCR test, this big piece of paper with little bitty tiny writing that you need a
Mhm.
magnifying glass for, you would see that it tells you all about the false positive, which is caused by at least 40 conditions. Two of them are pregnancy and breastfeeding.
Mhm.
So if your body is stressed, you will be positive for a PCR test, which is a false positive,
Okay.
because stress provokes your body to make more antibodies and to degrade genetic material.
Mhm. So you
Right?
said that
Even
pregnancy can be, you can
yes,
get a false.
pregnancy and breastfeeding will do this because it stresses the body.
Okay.
So, however, once the CDC declared that AIDS was caused by a virus, now they needed to come up with a way to treat it. So the pharmaceutical companies brought out a very old and very toxic drug called AZT for AIDS. It's a chemotherapy drug.
Okay.
In the first trial of AZT on HIV positive people without symptoms, it was given to 877, and another 872 got a placebo or just a sugar pill, right?
Mhm.
Over the 3 years of the trial, 79 people of the AZT that were taking AZT died,
Mhm.
and only 67 of the placebo died. So did they die of AIDS or the very toxic AZT drug? I would think that the evidence would show us that it's the AZT drug.
Mhm.
Fast forward to 2019 in China, where people were ill with a respiratory illness that didn't respond to antibiotics, that gave the excuse for another very toxic death-causing drug to be used, remdesivir.
Mhm.
No study has ever proven that coronavirus, or indeed any virus, is contagious. If I took the time here to tell you how virologists test for a virus, it would shock you at how fraudulent they are and how stupid they are,
Mhm.
because they don't actually test for a virus. They just, woo, mix up a bunch of shit. That's it. That's it. That's it. So, a virologist from Germany is the first one to ever have isolated a virus. He did this with sea algae and found that the sea algae with the virus were healthier and thriving than the sea algae without the virus.
Okay.
This is Dr. Stefan Lanka.
Okay.
He is the first scientist that has come to the conclusions that real viruses in the bodies of organisms are not pathogens, but they are integral to the healthy functioning of the host. He is the first to propose that in addition to a microbiome inside us, we also have a virome full of
Mhm.
viruses. And without this virome, we cannot be healthy. So again, let's talk briefly about the PCR test of the coronavirus, where the back of your throat is swabbed and then tested. The
Mhm.
PCR test examines the genetic pieces of material that come from that swab. The most important thing here to know is that no research has ever tested that genetic material from the back of your throat to determine that if it's unique to coronavirus or any kind of virus,
Mhm.
right? So no research has ever tested the genetic material from the back of your throat to find if it's unique or common. And to be a coronavirus, it would have to be unique. Right.
Yeah, and it's all, and the reports themselves say that it's the conclusion is made by an AI.
Right. The other faulty piece of the PCR test is that in order to examine the genetic material from the back of your throat, the test has to amplify the genetic material, make it bigger.
Mhm.
And if you do too many cycles of the amplification, it will give you a false positive. And if you don't do enough, it will give you a negative. So
Mhm.
the test is easily manipulated to get the results that are wanted.
Yeah. And then they
So that,
found evidence that the tests were stopped before the supposed virus got spread, and
yeah,
everybody had
no, it's all a bunch of, yeah, we're not going to get any deeper
bunch of
into
the.
the pandemic here because that's not our subject.
Mhm.
We're talking about the germ theory, right? So let's return to viruses, which are also now known as exosomes.
Mhm.
Exosomes are simple, well-characterized features in the cells of all creatures. When a living organism is threatened through starvation or through chemical poisoning or something else, the cells and tissues of the body have a mechanism for packaging and escorting these poisons out of the body to release them.
Mhm.
This is what the exosome does, and the exosomes are viruses.
Mhm.
For example, you have a poorly nourished organism, and then you give this organism a pill, or this organism cleans the house with bleach or ammonia, and it then goes to get an inoculation or immunization, and now it's just so full of toxins,
Mhm.
right? It's poorly nourished. This organism eats a totally unhealthy standard American diet of fully 100% processed foods with a shit ton of soda, cleaned its house with bleach, and then it heard on the news that it needed to go get a immunization, so it did, and now it's sicker than shit.
Mhm.
That's what the exosomes are doing. They're they're expelling all the viruses. I mean,
Mhm.
all the toxins.
Mhm.
So the tissues and cells that are affected begin to produce and package to secrete these poisons in the form of exosomes and viruses. This is their way of ridding themselves of the substances that do them great harm. So the more exposure to toxic assaults, the more exosomes or viruses will be produced. Studies have shown that if we stop the cells from making these exosomes or viruses, they get even more sick.
Mhm.
So all those antiviral pills make you even more sick.
Okay.
The exosomes or viruses also act as a kind of key that circulate through your blood and lymph system until they find a cell with the keyhole that they can fit into.
Mhm.
And when they do this, then the exosome or virus can tell that cell, "Hey, look, there's danger coming. Be prepared.
Mhm.
Make exosomes. Make more of me."
Mhm.
So exosomes or viruses are crucial detoxification processes of all our cells and tissues. There is now clear experimental evidence that exosomes or viruses made by one organism can be picked up by other organisms of the same species or even different species and cause protective reactions in the other organism.
Oh, wow. Wow. There's evidence of that. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one study showed that if mice are exposed to the liver toxin known as Tylenol or
Mhm.
acetaminophen, the liver cells increase their production of protective exosomes.
Wow.
So the researchers isolated and purified these exosomes or viruses and exposed other mice to them. The second group of mice did not get sick from the liver toxin known as Tylenol or acetaminophen because of these exosomes.
Mhm.
They developed protective responses in their livers, and the livers secreted more exosomes, therefore pulling the Tylenol, acetaminophen, out of their system and excreting it.
Mhm.
Trees will do the same thing with beetle infestations. So thanks to exosomes, nature is a superb cooperative adventure. The originally affected tree is not competing with survival with other trees, as Charles Darwin would have us believe. The affected tree needs other trees in order to survive and thrive. And so we also need each other, members of our own species and other species. Otherwise, none of us will thrive.
Mhm.
So the germ theory is wrong. The virus theory is wrong, because viruses and bacteria or microorganisms are not here to kill us. Viruses, exosomes' role is to produce the detoxification package and communication system that allows us to live a full, healthy existence. Bacteria and other microorganisms also break down diseased tissue so that it can be rebuilt. So a war on bacteria, a war on viruses and microorganisms is a war on life.
Mhm.
So what causes disease if bacteria and viruses don't? Well, the majority of illnesses that seem seem to be contagious are in reality just people exposed to similar toxins or suffering from the same nutritional deficiencies and being stressed all the time.
Mm-hmm.
The quality of water we drink, the quality of food we eat, the level and type of toxins, including mental and emotional toxins that we've been exposed to, is what causes disease. So today's water contains chlorine and chloramine, which are incredibly toxic. It also contains fluoride, an industrial waste that is toxic to our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
The water from all those many plastic water bottles that we buy contains microplastics, which line our intestines and congest them. The water also contains residues of many pharmaceutical drugs and all the insecticides, herbicides, and fertilizers sprayed by people onto their lawns and their gardens.
Mm-hmm.
So our water is sick and toxic and is a major contributor of our illness. And currently, most people consume processed food that is a totally man-made and incredibly toxic. Or we eat devitalized produce that comes in from long distances away rather than finding our local farmers and getting the produce from them.
Mm-hmm.
Included is that most of us take all sorts of pills. We don't breathe naturally. And so then we have a predominance of bacteria in our gut that make toxins because of the low oxygen state and all the toxic food and water.
Mm-hmm.
We also eat meat from animals that stand knee deep in shit instead of being able to graze like they're meant to. So they're full of toxins, and the same with our milk and butter and cheeses.
Mm-hmm.
And we must remember that fever and inflammation are simply detoxification processes, not diseases that need to be suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 1890s, as the germ theory was becoming fully embedded, a new invention came to the scene: the stainless steel roller press. This gleaming contraption allowed manufacturers to express oil from hard seeds like corn kernels, cotton seeds, and soybeans. Primitive stone presses work only for oily seeds like sesame, flax, rapeseed, and for oily fruits like olives, coconut, and palm fruit.
Mm-hmm.
The primitive stone press extracts oil slowly and without heat, so the final product is very natural and very healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Oil from cottonseed, which is a waste product of the cotton industry, was the first fabrication of this new mechanized press. Like all industrial seed oil, cottonseed oozes out of the crushed seed as a dark, smelly gunk that no one in their right mind would consume.
Okay.
High temperature. So then they go on to process it with high temperature, which involves lots of chemicals, and then deodorize and bleach it. And the dark, smelly gunk is transformed into a product that they used for candles. But as electricity came on the scene, the candle industry declined. So what were they going to do with all this expensive infrastructure they invented? Well, they continued making the oil so they could feed it to us.
Wow. Man.
It took 40 years for these industrial seed oils to replace animal fats for cooking and baking. And it was actually cheap once they started making them because the initial infrastructure was there. They're stainless steel machines. They don't have to make new ones every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was cheap to make these processed oils, and they made the processed food industry possible. And with all their profit, they were able to get the World Health Organization to recommend a diet containing these toxic oils instead of natural animal fats.
They satanized animal fats.
Yep. And no other dietary change has been so destructive. Industrial feed oil production fills our bellies but starves our cells. And the same can be said of industrial grain production. A triumph of industrial grain processing is the transformation of grains of wheat into loaves of bread in their plastic petroleum-based bags in 2 hours, from field to bread in a plastic petroleum-based bag, 2 hours. as well as the high temperature, high pressure processes that produce our dry breakfast cereals like Cheerios and Wheaties. Our traditional non-industrialized cultures from around the world did not eat grains in this way. Instead, they subjected them to long, slow fermentation processes to produce things like sourdough bread. They also produced their alcohol, of course, low alcohol percentage alcohol. And these low percentage alcohol beverages were actually very nourishing.
Mm-hmm.
Because the human gut could then process the grain better, right? And it was this low alcoholic beverage was chock full of vitamins, especially the B vitamins.
Mm-hmm.
So they called it small beer, and it was a common beverage. Benjamin Franklin drank it as a kid for breakfast.
Yeah.
It nourished the gut flora by providing structured water around the fizzy bubbles and had B vitamins galore. And we'll talk about structured water in another talk.
Okay.
So grains that have not been soaked, sprouted, or fermented are very difficult for humans to digest. But yet our modern grain products, including the trendy health products like oat bran, fill our belly, but they do not nourish, they even poison us.
Mm-hmm.
So careful preparation can transform grains into real food, increasing the B vitamins and liberating materials for our bodies to use properly, but commercial production does not transform that properly. So starved and poisoned, the typical civilized person of any color soon develops one or more chronic diseases and seeks medical advice. Once in the clutches of the doctor, this person now becomes the target of even more toxins. 70% of people in advanced nations now take at least one prescription drug that is poison, and the vast majority of us take 5.
Wow.
That's where disease comes from.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going to end for right now, because there's so much more to talk about in regards to nutrition and other stuff, poisons.
So we're not even going into the sexual ones yet.
Well, so
We touched AIDS, but
we can touch that a little bit, because that's a very so what is it that makes things like chickenpox, measles, mumps, and herpes, STDs, so contagious? Well, Luc Montagnier, however you say his last name, he did a study where he put DNA in a beaker with water, and then he mixed up the DNA, destroyed it, so it was only pieces of DNA in a beaker with water in another room. They weren't even connected. He shined violet light on the or ultraviolet light, or some on infrared light, something like that, on the beaker with the DNA in it, and within a few hours or days, the beaker in the other room had fully organized DNA. So the proposal is, this is resonance, right? If you pluck the string of a guitar, all the other strings, the same strings of all the other guitars in the room, will start to vibrate. So what causes this contagion? Well, kids, they get a shit ton of immunizations, right? They need to detox. So they all gather at school for school, and one of them gets sick, and the message goes around, we all need to detox. So the disease shows up if they need to detox. It doesn't if they don't need to detox. And it's the same with herpes. Is that sex is a potent, highly charged event, and a man and a woman coming together are creating a new exosome that will, and if it's necessary for either one of them, that there's a disease, that there's something that needs to be detoxed, that coming together will cause this detox. And now it's labeled by science as herpes virus and contagious, but it's not. It's just simply a detox process.
Right. And I read about
But there's so much more on this, and there's not a whole lot of research on it. But that's just a simple explanation of the fact that there is no such thing as sexually transmitted diseases. They're simply detoxification processes caused by a partnership with a new person, and your body all of a sudden goes, oh fuck, I have, right?
Yeah, and you can get contagious of all kinds of things just by talking to someone, not because of a mechanical thing, because we are empathic beings.
We're resonant.
I had a friend that was telling me about how she was feeling really bad, and I started feeling really bad.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't even get into the emotions. That's just the mechanics.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but we're of course we transmit each other things, and
but it's not disease. It's a need for, we transmit things in someone's body. It might say, oh my God, now we need to detox. And then another person's, it's like, I don't need to detox. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing with the yearly quotes colds. It's also, we have to look at the season. That's part of the season, right? To detox.
Yeah. And then there's factors today like electromagnetic pollution that we need to detox from.
Well, and that's what the exosomes do, is they help us. The virus has exosomes, as they help us adapt to those without getting sick.
Right.
So, this is just barely scratching the surface.
Okay, are we going to go deeper into this?
Not for right now. Next week we're going to go into desire.
Okay. Desire as just like that, plain?
Yes, desire. The importance of desire, because it is the life force. It was Ishmukune's desire to connect.
Okay.
That caused her to start singing and give birth to all of us. Spider Woman's desire, Holy Mother.
I saw a post, a meme that said, you don't need this. You don't need just intention. You need a flaming desire to do something. You need to be burning up.
Intention is a very watered down form of desire. It's a very mechanistic form of desire.
Yeah.
So, and it's the new age spiritual guru thing of set your intention before. No, what's your desire? What do you desire to receive from this?
What are you burning up for? And if you're not burning up for something, please turn on the fire in your life, because
exactly,
you're gonna grow
cold.
But
we don't have knowledge of desire. We've been taught that it means to be suppressed.
I have a lot of flaming desire for many things, and I think it's
and
crucial.
We think desire is sexual. There's a very strong sexual component to it,
and we also get taught by New Age Buddhism that if you let go of desire, then you're free of suffering, because you don't.
Well, see, we're going to talk about that, and it's not letting go of the desire; it's letting go of the attachment to the outcome.
Yeah, there you go.
And then it's also the fact that once we get what we desire, the satisfaction only lasts for a certain amount of time. So therefore we think, by suffering, I shouldn't, but we don't understand that desire always pushes us to desire something more now. And so that has led us to our consumerism, but it's not, the desire is not to consume something more, it's to do something bigger with your life.
It's a source of life.
It is, absolutely, because without desire,
otherwise we just sit and
become apathetic, bumps on a log.
Yeah, all living beings would just be dull, same looking kind of species if there wasn't this desire to grow, to be different, to be bigger, to be more colorful, to be more light, to be so many different ways you can take it.
Yeah.
Like nature. Yeah. Nature is an example of why would birds, some birds develop such amazing colors and chants and Oh, they got a very mechanical explanation for that, but
Oh, they do. Yeah.
they don't take into account the aliveness of the universe and the
Exactly. They don't take into account Holy Mother.
yeah, and they never do that.
Yeah.
Wow. So wow, it's an hour now, and so the importance of desire for next week,
The importance of
8:45,
desire.
8:45, Wednesdays. Don't miss it. Coming to our 144th conversation, and with anything, we just say thank you. Waterfalls of blessings for everyone. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Yep.